Um, Thank you. I was just about to ask. Record the meeting. Thank you, Andrew. So first, does anyone have any announcements before you get lost in other things? And doesn't look like it. Okay. And I think, I believe, Andres, this is your first time joining this meeting. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself a little bit, say who you are, what you're working on, how you came to be here.
Yeah, hi everyone. This is my first time joining the meeting. I come from the University of Arizona. I did my PhD there with John Chorover as my co-advisor, and both TomEixner and John Chorover. I did most of my PhD work was at the GEMES in New Mexico, and I looked at working a lot of like the fire. A lot of like pre and post fire data from the Valle, mainly looking at the geochemistry part of it. So I talk briefly. Right now, I am a new hire, a new faculty at USC, Southern California, here in LA, and I'm just join here the group and see what are you all doing and see what I can contribute and collaborate with everyone.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you could join. And is there anyone else who's on the call today who has not gotten to introduce themselves to the larger group? Rachel, I'm not sure if you have.
Yeah, this is my first time joining the meeting. Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel. I'm a new PhD student working at UNR with Adrian Harpold and Gabrielle on this project. But I also am a hydrologist at Yosemite National Park. So excited to get more involved with the work going on in the Illilouette Basin in the park here.
And I jumped on late. This is Jamie Shanley. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey in Vermont, and I run the Sleepers River watershed. Hello, everyone.
Thanks, Jamie. All right, anyone else who has not gotten a chance recently to introduce themselves to the group or who's here for the first time? Don't think so. Just I'm looking quickly at the names. Okay. So I was thinking I would start out with sort of giving a reminder or an intro to people who haven't seen some of this before on the types of things we're thinking about in terms of disturbance in the Southwest. And of course, this will be oversimplified and leave a few things out because I don't want to take too much time away from discussions later, but just to get everyone sort of on the same page for our discussions today. There we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about hydrology and disturbance in the Southwest. This is a picture that I took actually when I was out with Rachel in Yosemite just a few months ago, looking at an area that had burned last summer. And you can see in the background, it's all pretty charred, but there's lots of vegetation growing back. There's some aspen that maybe didn't even burn. And you can see this little stream coming through. And so we're thinking about how does this type of landscape with the burned areas and the regrowth that's happening and the changes over time interact, this little stream and then the bigger rivers that it flows into in terms of water quality and quantity, and how does that interact with droughts, with natural climate variation, to influence the resilience of these landscapes over the long term. And a lot of these places in the arid Southwest are adapted to fire. They are historically at a lot of different elevations. You know, these places would burn because of pretty dry summers. In high elevations, you get lightning ignited fires. And so fires can act as sort of a method to thin out the overstory vegetation, allow more sunlight and water to reach the ground to allow new vegetation to grow. And so, like Andrew was saying, my big thing is that like, fire is not just a bad thing, it can also be a good thing. But sort of each specific landscape has its own balance of how much fire is helpful and how much is too much or too little. If you have too much fire, you can get flooding and erosion because you don't have plants protecting the soil and roots holding the soil in place. You can also alter the physical soil properties, so water runs off faster and creates bigger, dirtier floods. Sometimes plants can't regrow if things get so hot that it damages the soil and kills the seed bank. But if you have too little fire, then a bunch of trees can take over and block all the water, and new younger plants can't grow anymore because the adult trees are taking everything over. And then if you do get a drought, you have all these big trees that all of a sudden don't have enough water, and you can have massive tree die-offs like we've seen in a lot of the Southwest in the last couple of decades. And then when you have too little fire, then when you do have a fire, eventually all this fuel has been building up over years and years and years. So when there is a fire that gets out of control, it can get huge, cause a lot of devastation, cause a lot more disturbance than the area is adapted to, and then it's not a resilient landscape. And then if you have the natural amount of fire, theoretically, there's this like optimum balance where the trees that remain after the fire don't have to share their water and resources with as many other trees. And you can get more water flowing downstream because it's not all being soaked up by all these dense, thirsty forests. You can be more resilient to droughts. There's more individual fires, and fires are happening more often, but each one is relatively small, and new plants can regrow pretty quickly because you're not killing all the seed bank in the area and you're not damaging the soil too much, theoretically. And so when there's this natural amount, then everything can be perfectly balanced, as all things should be. Not that you should follow Thanos's methods exactly, of course. But the difficulty is knowing where that balance is, and it varies a lot geographically by ecotone, according to geology, etc. And so this is a slide that I've used many times just to kind of sum up the different counteracting processes that are at play that we have to think about when we're trying to understand post-fire hydrology. So if you have a fire and you remove trees, then more rain and snow can reach the ground. And also, if you have fewer trees, you're losing less water to the atmosphere through plant roots, through transpiration. Even although sometimes if you get a lot of really dense regrowth after a fire, then a lot of small plants might end up actually transpiring more water than a few big trees, depending on the situation. But then on the flip side of that, you have on the flip side of losing less water to transpiration in the open, you might lose more water to evaporation from the shallow soil and from the ground surface because you don't have trees shading the ground, helping to reduce that ground surface evaporation. And then also, if you have a lot of bare soil, that can cause a lot of erosion and higher runoff, like I talked about. So you have some aspects of a fire and removing trees that will lead to more water available for streams and available for storage in the subsurface, but then you have other aspects of it, like increased evaporation and increased erosion that can be worse for your water quality and for your stream flow. And then when it comes to snowpack, things get really complicated. In some places, when you're out in the open, that helps to keep more snow. In some places out in the open, the snow melts faster because it's exposed to the sun, and it depends on your local temperature, aspect, elevation, etc. And that's a big thing that we're looking at, is in what places do you get more snowpack sticking around after the fire, and in what places do you get less snowpack sticking around after the fire. And it can be really hard to sort of try and experimentally or observationally see the impact of a single disturbance event, like 1 year of fire or 1 year of drought, because this region gets so much interannual variability. So for example, this picture here is a camera that we had out in March 2022. So this is before that fire I showed a picture of earlier. And it was a really dry year. And then a little over a year later, a fire had come through. So you can see there's a bunch of black ash everywhere. And the main difference you can see is this camera is now buried in snow in April of 2023, because it was an extremely different year hydrologically. There was tons of rain and snow. It was colder, at least in the Sierras, especially in the southern mid Sierras. Definitely Thanos's fault. Thank you, Ben. So you can see, and this is just like natural variability that, I mean, possibly exaggerated by climate change. But like when you have 1 year where late March looks like this, and 1 year where late March, that same area is entirely buried in snow, it's really hard to say, oh, this year a fire happened, and the next year the hydrology looked different, and therefore it was because of the fire. No, there's so much change every year anyway. You have to think about it in a more complicated way to figure out what did the fire do. And so we do lots of data collection and statistics, trying to compare areas that burned to nearby areas that didn't burn, control for the differences between them. And then we can also do some process-based modeling, is a sort of parallel approach that we're taking. And then I tried to fit this into the inductive deductive framework that we've been talking about, that Kristen gave a great presentation on last time. And Kristen and Julia, feel free to interject if you think I've represented anything incorrectly here. But the way I was thinking about it is, at least the way that I first came to studying this topic, is that there were some people at UC Berkeley, where I was going to school, who had observed that it seems like in some places where the forest burned down, it's a lot wetter after the fire than it was before. And so then they tried to look more at the pattern and develop a hypothesis. Collected data, did some statistics, reviewed the literature. I got involved with my advisor, because the foresters who had first been noticing some of these changes wanted to get a hydrologist involved. Not that we were the only people looking at this question, but it is kind of a relatively new area of hydrology. And then from looking at those patterns and the data, we developed a theory that, broadly simplified, is that in places where you have the potential to store more water because of what the soil is like, and because of what the topography is like it's a low area where water can gather, then if you have a fire, that is likely to lead to higher soil water content after the fire, when you've removed all the vegetation, because you have that reduced interception loss, reduced transpiration, and in some places increased snowpack. And then the deductive part of that loop is like, okay, we have that theory. And so if that theory is true, I hypothesize that in this specific area, I should be able to see higher soil moisture after a fire. And then I can collect data, run some models to see if that is in fact true. And then we can either confirm that our hypothesis was correct, which upholds our first theory, or maybe our data and models aren't showing what we expected. And then we could say, oh, okay, maybe we need to refine our theory a little bit, or we were wrong about something. And so we can go back to getting more observations, or we can go refine our theory a little bit directly and try some more data analysis and model running. So that's just sort of a framework and example of how we're thinking about some of these things. And this is sort of a graphical representation of a hypothesis we have that Adrian and I worked on this for actually the original proposal for this CZN funding. Saying one of the hypotheses we want to test is that there is this feedback between the subsurface CZN structure and the surface CZN structure, meaning the vegetation, and what happens with hydrology and then feedbacks with the fire. And sorry, I didn't say that super clearly, but basically this is sort of our conceptual model hypothesis that like, okay, you can have either sparse fuels or dense fuels. That's the surface CZO structure, critical zone structure. And then underground, you can either have low storage capacity or high storage capacity. And then I won't go through all the things, but then if you have a fire, that's going to affect these different type of landscapes differently, which is going to feed into what the snow does, going to feed into what's happening with subsurface water storage, is going to feed into how healthy the plants are, and how dry they are, which then feeds into what the next fire does. And it's a whole feedback. So that's sort of the framing of a lot of the questions we're trying to ask through this project. And we have different locations. We can explore this both within Yosemite and the places that I've been working a long time, and then also comparing the fires that we see in Yosemite to ones that we see in the Jemez, where Andres has been working, where you have a drier area that has a little bit of a different climate. They have some summer monsoons, and they've had some fires that are a lot bigger than some of the fires that we're seeing in the Yosemite study sites. So between those two different study watersheds and different areas within each of those watersheds, we can get some nice variations in climate, topography, vegetation, and fire activity over which we can explore this. So toward the end of the hour, we're going to talk about some of the big picture questions we have and see if any of you have thoughts about those or places where you might be able to fit into parts of that whole inductive, deductive, or pattern to process cycle. But first, we're going to look at some more specific examples of things that people are working on already. And so we have Andrew and Ijaz. And Andrew, would you mind presenting first?
Yeah, I can go first.
I think, yes, there you are. Great. Are you able to take control of the screen?
I'll try.
If not, you sent me the link so I can show the slides, but
I think that
always nice if you
I'm
can.
able to.
Great.
All right, good. Can everyone see it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So yeah, this past year I've been working at on the Jemez to understand the impacts of wildfires and how it affected hydrology and chemistry. So I've been looking at it from a pattern to process approach or an inductive approach. So this is a picture I took about a month ago when I visited the site. This is in the History Grove catchment. And what we see is that a huge portion of the catchment had been burned. Essentially the entire center of the image was historical old growth ponderosa pine trees and is now not that. And still in the 10 years since the fire, there's minimal growth of new trees. So this is, I mean, on here I say it's Lahara because that's the catchment I've been studying, but Lahara is very similar to this in that it was burned at high intensity and pretty extensively. And another important fact is that this is roughly a southern aspect catchment, very roughly. And the pattern that we observe in the stream flow is this. So the blue is the pre-fire discharge and the red is the post-fire discharge. And this is a pattern that we observe in wildfire affected catchments. It's the discharge has increased very significantly following the fire, following the Thompson Ridge fire. This is one pattern that we've observed in the catchment, or in the VCNP, the Valles Caldera National Preserve in the Jemez Mountains. But if we look just at a different catchment that's just, a kilometer away, at the Upper Jaramillo catchment, which was also burned, not quite as extensively, but has the same climate, roughly the same size, very similar land coverage before the fire. We can see that this catchment was burned much less intensely and at a much lower severity than La Jara. And the discharge pattern that we observe in this catchment is very different behavior. I can see that there is probably a difference in the discharge behavior after the fire, but it's much less pronounced. The peaks in the post-fire discharge are much less pronounced. So that leads me to some of my questions are, why are there differences? Like, what are the controlling factors that lead to the differences in these two behaviors? So this is a pretty simple table on some of the results or some of the differences between these two catchments. So Upper Jaramillo and La Jara roughly had pretty similar discharges before the fire. This is a median discharge. But then after the fire, Upper Jaramillo roughly doubles the average, the median discharge roughly doubles, but in La Jara, it's nearly 5 times greater. So what are the controlling factors? Like what really influences that? So two things that that differ between these two catchments are that La Jara was burned much more intensely relatively, and it's a southwards facing catchment. So that brings me to some of my work is how do catchment aspect and burn severity impact fire response after a fire. And my approach is to model this with HBV. So I'm using an inductive approach, as we saw just with Gabrielle's presentation, of taking the data, observing some patterns, and trying to understand that from the data. So I've been using HBV to model the hydrology. I won't talk too much about this, but it's to show that I was able to calibrate a model using HBV and got pretty good results. And in terms of some of the numbers of these modeling results, in terms of the flow paths, like surface runoff, shallow soil flow, and base flow, how each of these changed following the fire in the La Jara subcatchment. What I found using my model is that I observed that all 3 of those flow paths, surface runoff, shallow soil runoff, and base flow, have increased very significantly, at minimum of 2.75 times increase. And this is bringing in the processes from the patterns that we observed in the data. The processes of the changing discharge are that each of the flow paths increase significantly. There's so much more water moving through each of those flow paths that show up in the stream. This analysis is a little one-sided right now because I don't have any modeling results yet for Upper Jaramillo, but that will come soon. But that brings me to some of my bigger questions are, how did the flow partitioning in Upper Jaramillo change in a catchment that burned much less intensely and has a different primary aspect, of like a northwards aspect? So then I want to be able to parse out, how did the burn severity impact these 2 catchments, and how does the aspect, the slope, the catchment aspect, how does that change the hydrologic response after a fire? And then I'd like to, but I have not had good results yet of understanding the chemical weathering fluxes in each of these catchments, but I spent a lot of time on that and didn't get good results. So that's kind of that's a goal for the far off, might not get completed. But that's what I've been working on over the past, roughly a year or so. And if anyone has questions, I'm open to them.
Great, thank you. And I think someone's been typing some questions into the agenda.
Okay.
Got one. The fact that base flow is so much higher after fire, does that mean recharge is important?
Yeah, I expect that it's important. So I didn't put pictures on here, but what I looked at is before the fire, the catchment was completely forested by ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests. But after the fire, and even today, there's been, La Jara at least, has almost been completely deforested, and what's growing back now is like small plants, grasses, and shrubs, and some, aspen trees, and maybe some like 1 to 2 year old saplings of coniferous trees. And what that means is that there's so many fewer big trees to drop soil water, to drop soil moisture, which to me means that there's so much more water entering the ground and can become recharged that can then enter the stream. So it's like the loss of the trees was a big perturbation to the water balance in the catchment. So yes, recharge I think is way more important now than before.
Can I ask a quick follow-on question, if timing is okay? If not, feel free to answer in the chat also. But I always pictured that after a fire, the soil is quite hydrophobic and that infiltration is difficult. Do you see that in the data that at the beginning you have less base flow and actually more overland flow as opposed to later on this dynamic shifts?
So at least in the model that we've been using, HBV, before and after the fire, over 90% of the water in the stream comes from base flow. And that doesn't change too much after the fire. I mean, these numbers right here, so base flow is by far the most important contributor, and like shallow surface runoff and shallow soil runoff increased significantly, but in terms of the overall water balance, they weren't all that important. And as to hydrophobicity, yeah, I mean, I expect that infiltration would be reduced pretty significantly, but then there's a counteracting effect of, there's no trees to draw up that soil water. So there's a net increase in recharge is how I interpret that.
Yeah, and that hydrophobicity can definitely happen, Juliet, just kind of in general. But it can be very spatially patchy. And also in these snowy watersheds, often like having a snowpack sit on top of the soil and then slowly infiltrate in will kind of wear away at that hydrophobicity. When you just have that like big giant store of water slowly adding water in, it takes some very, very hydrophobic soil to not be able to take in that slowly melting snowpack.
So Andrew, maybe, I don't know if you have these figures, like the Q, for example, if you plot a Q naught, Q1, like the flow from different paths as a function of time, do you see, for example, Q naught is dominating at like high flow time, like when you have a big precipitation event? Something like that maybe can help to convey that message.
Yeah, that'd be a good point. Q naught is surface runoff. That is the surface runoff analog in our model, but it's only present in the snowmelt peak, some of those really big peaks. Not so much in big monsoons, at least according to this model.
And someone else asked, how do the soils differ, if at all, between the two catchments? For example, depth to bedrock?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I'm really interested in that. Have not been able to find good information on that, but
I know there were some geophysical measurements, but I don't know if they got in both catchments. Andres or Adrian or Julia, do any of you know?
Yeah, there's definitely some implied differences in soil depth. If you go back to some of the publications there, but direct observations, I think the geophysics were too small of a footprint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like Ben put citations to some related work in the meeting notes and in the chat. So thank you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the really cool work, Andrew. The Sarah Goking's work has kind of asked this question, trying to apply the Eastern runoff response that primarily was informed by, temperate catchments that weren't water limited. They were energy limited in a Boudico framework. And she's found that it's really a crapshoot in these drier, higher energy systems. And I'd love to know kind of where your site falls in that range, and if it fits the general predictions that she'd made.
Okay, I'll take a look. I'm unfamiliar with her work right now, but I mean, I know that there are people in this group that are really interested in the Bodico framework. So thank you for the paper recommendation too.
All right, I think should move, if people have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I think we should move on to our next presentation to make sure we have plenty of time. Ijaz, are you ready to go?
Yes. Let me share my screen. So can you see on something on the screen, my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So today I'm going to discuss the impact of forest fires on soil moisture and temperature. This data was provided by Gabriel, and this is not my core research side. I'm a computer science student, so my main PhD research is related to core computer science stuff, but I work with the data for these NSF projects to look at what's going on like in the data. All right, so our study analyzes the effect of forest fires on soil parameters across different stations at Illilouette Creek Basin. So there are three stations actually. The first one is shrubs, and the other one is, I cannot see my screen. Can you guys see that? What is that? The other one is the forest site, which is site A, and the third one is wetland. So there was a big fire in 2017, and we are looking at some variables, what happened to them pre and post fire at all these stations. So I will start from a deductive approach because I discussed with Gabriel, and she said our study is kind of starting from deductive. So we're gonna go like this. So the theory here is we theorized that forest fires affect soil moisture and temperature, and hypothesis or specific hypothesis was that forest fires would reduce soil moisture and alter soil temperatures across depths. So this is one bar chart. If you can see, soil moisture analysis are there. So I will go through a little bit quick. I have a lot of plots here, so you're gonna bear with me a little. So how it is, the station A, if you look at mixed conifer site, depth 1 till 3, there's a decrease in soil moisture post-fire. And at station B, you can see that depth 1 has a slight decrease, depth 2, notable decrease, and depth 3, significant decrease. And at station 3, at station C, which is wetland vegetation, the depth 1 minor increases there, and depth 2 and 3 stable to slight decrease. So the key takeaway here is like predominant decrease in soil moisture post-fire across sites can be seen. Unique rise at the station C, depth 1. So this is another, these are another graphs, temporal progression of soil moistures across all the sites. So if you can see the station A is this from the right side. There is a noticeable decrease in soil moisture post-fire at all depths. And at station B, there is consistent decline in soil moisture post-fire across all the depths. And at station C, the wetland vegetation station, there is if you see the depth 1, minor increase in post-fire. And then at depth 2, it's kind of stable, if you can notice that. So at the depth 3, there is a slight decrease in there. So the graph insights, you can see like there's a daily, that this is like daily VWC trends or airs. VWC is volumetric water concentration with a clear distinction between pre and post fire periods, and the x-axis actually represent the airs for the clearer view. Okay, this is something I calculated. I'm not sure if we should trust it, but seems like, I don't know, from the data. This is like rate of recovery days to approach pre-fire VWC levels. So if you can see at station A, Depth 1 is recovering around in 10 days. I'm not sure if it's right or wrong, but it is what the data and the calculation told me. And depth 2 and 3, it took like 120 days, almost 4 months. And at station B, depth 1 and 2 took 10 days to recover, and the depth 3 took like 140 days, which is like 4.5 months. And at station C, you can see all depths immediately recovered. I don't know, that's why there is no yellow color there. And it can be seen in there is a graph onwards, maybe you can see there. It was here, maybe. You see the wetland vegetation, the post-fire data looks like this. Like, I don't know why it didn't affected this kind of land. This theory, I mean, Gabriel should follow up with this, how this can happen, because I have less theoretical knowledge about it. All right, so these are some heat maps, which is pre and post fire. I'm just showing for depth 1. If I show for all the depths, it's going to be like 12 of them, so it's will be difficult to follow. So let's just discuss this. If you can see that I'm doing it for cold and wet seasons. So there is like at station A and B, decrease in the soil moisture, particularly there is a decrease in soil moisture, particularly in early months. And station C, there is a stable moisture level throughout. And in the warm and dry season, which is like on the right side, these graphs, you can see that station A and B is lower in moisture, especially in the initial months. And station C consistently higher moisture levels there. So the key takeaway in this one is like different stations and depths exhibit varied moisture pattern. Post-fire depth plays a role in moisture retention, with deeper layers being more consistent. And this is some Pearson correlation coefficient between air and soil temperature. You can see at all depths for each station pre and post-fire. You can see that there is a strong positive correlation in like station A data. You can see that there is a strong positive correlation in both scenarios, pre and post fire. There's a slight decrease in post fire correlation at depth 1. And at station B, you can see that there is a strong positive correlation pre and post fire. There's a slight decrease in post fire correlation at depth 1. And at C, you can see the wetland vegetation. There is a strong positive correlation pre-fires across all the depths. Minor decrease you can see in the post-fire correlation, notably like at the depth 2. So the overall insight on this one is like air and soil temperature are positively correlated across all the depths and station, but subtle variation observed in correlation strength between pre and post-fire scenarios. So if you see this kind of graph is like seasonal variation of air and soil temperature. The data of A was a lot of missing data in the air temperature, which we are trying to fill the gaps using some techniques. That's ongoing work, but I'm just plotting what I had that time. So if you see the station A, like air temperature, there is a clear seasonal trend. And in soil temperature, more buffered than air temperature, especially deeper. So post-fire depth 1 cools down, especially in cold months. And I know there is like no month mentioned on there, but like if you can guess where is the cold month coming in there. So in the cold months, depth 2 and 3 are actually stable in the station 1. Station B, you can see air temperature. There is a seasonal trend, and soil temperature. There after like post-fire cooling across all depths, and there is a it's pronounced in the cold months actually. Okay, and then if you talk about the station C, so the air temperature is consistent with A and B. But the soil temperature at depth 1 and 2 cool downs post-fire, especially in the cold months. Depth 3 remains stable. So the overall insight from this one is that soil temperature generally minor soil temperatures, generally minor air temperatures, but are less volatile, especially like deeper levels. And post-fire, there is like shallower depths across all the stations. Shows a temperature decrease predominantly in the cooler months. So this is a very crazy graph, a lot of graphs. You don't need to maybe see it right now. If you want to see, you can, but I will just go through it very quickly. So the blue dots here represent the pre-fire data, and the red dots present the post-fire data. So station A, B, and C. So if you have a look at the station A, the cold and wet part of it, like post-fire soil temperatures cooler at depth 1 and 2, and depth 3 shows a similar trend, but less pronounced. And at station and in warm and dry, post-fire data closer to air temperature, indicating less differences. Depth 3 post-fire data is slightly more cooler. And similarly, station B, if you see the cold and wet, linear relationship in temperature, post-fire data is cooler, especially at depth 1 and 2. And in warm and dry season, it's like a linear relationship maintained. So depth 1 and 2 are cooler even post-fire. And for the C, you can see the temperature align closely, depth 1 and 2 cooler after the fire, and in the warm weather, temperature aligns closely, depth 1 and 2 cooler post-fire as well. So overall insight is like the soil temperatures generally mirror air temperatures. Post-fire temperatures tends to be cooler, especially in the cold and wet season. And this one is just a general overall graph where we can see that, for example, if you see at the air temperature on the right side, you can see what each color means here. So higher air temperature is higher in warm and dry versus cold and wet season. The post-fire, there is a slight drop in cold and wet season for station A and B, and C remains stable. So soil temperature follow the air temperature trend across all depths. Post-fire, there is a noticeable drop during cold and wet season, especially at station A. And soil moisture, if you can see, there is a higher it's higher in cold and wet season, and the post-fire there is an increase in moisture for station A and B during cold and wet season. So the key takeaway here is that fire impacts the environmental variables differently across the seasons. The cold and wet season shows more pronounced effects, especially for temperature metrics. So inductive approach, now we come back to the inductive approach here. So observations here. Upon analysis, we observe specific pattern in post-fire data. The pattern here is like post-fire, we notice decreased in soil moisture, especially during the cold and wet season. And tentative hypothesis is that based on this, we hypothesize that the recovery rate might be influenced by vegetation type. That's just my thinking. I'm not very pro in this area. And implications and theory insights. So our findings indicate long-term shifts in environmental patterns due to fires. And the theory can be that these shifts can influence ecosystem health, water availability, and more. And conclusion and future direction. In conclusion, forest fires have a pronounced impact on soils parameter with potential long-term environmental implication. The future studies could explore recovery mechanism or delve deeper into the role of vegetation. So this is just, I'm trying to prepare for my AGU. I will include causal analysis between all the variables using some techniques available. And any questions, please ask Gabriel. I'm kidding. Okay, you can ask me something.
And we have maybe time for one quick question. And then we have a little more things to discuss, but people can put questions in the chat. And I think this is a nice example of ways that we can explore the data, but also need to keep in mind like the natural variability, like that 2017 year you saw right before the fire, there was really high soil moisture, but that was partly because that was an extremely wet year. There was a lot more rain and snow that fell in 2017 compared to in 2018, right after the fire. But thanks to some of these correlation analyses and some of the different statistics that Ijaz is working on that try and tease out some causal relationships, we can hopefully account for some of that interannual variability. And since we have the different sites that burned more or less severely, like that site B burned really high severity, and site A didn't change all that much after the fire, comparing how those two responded differently to the fire. can help us a little bit. That's some of the patterns that we can look at to help us hopefully infer some of the processes. Okay, we can have one quick question and then I'm going to take the screen back over.
Okay, should I stop the screen or it should be here?
You can leave it for 1 more minute.
Okay.
If does anyone have any question they want to ask live, otherwise you can just put it in the chat and chat about it in the background. All right, I'm gonna give it over. I'm gonna
Take the screen
take
over.
the screen back over.
And Ijas, there is a question for you that's showing up in the notes document, but I'm going to paste the link in.
Yeah, so we wanted to go over some of the big questions that you've seen some examples of exploring them from those last 2 talks. And the main headers are like, under what kind of circumstances can a fire help create a more resilient landscape? And whereas the flip side of that would be a less resilient landscape. And then a big part of that we want to look at is, when does fire lead to either more or less snow and stream flow? And I'll let Adrian talk about those in a little more detail. If he's there. Yeah.
I am, but I was muted. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is try to blow through this pretty quick just to save a few minutes if folks have comments. But is the next slide the data assimilation slide? Oh yeah, but with some weird no, ignore my animations for a second. So work that we are starting to do now with Rachel Hallman, a new PhD student, Gabrielle, and we're interviewing and hopefully hiring a new postdoc, asking the question of how does snowpack amount and melt timing change after forest fires. We have incredible observations before and after the fire, but the problem is that we have different years, like Gabrielle said. We have different timings of the flight. So despite, having better data than anyone's ever had in the history of humankind, we still can't directly observe this problem. But our physical models also have issues because we're having to make all these sort of inductive assumptions about the processes. So if you go, is it going to bring in an animation if you hit the next slide? Oh no. Okay. I don't know. Doesn't look like my screen, but that's okay.
You want to share your screen?
Yeah, I could do that really quick. This is supposed to be fast. Share screen. All right, can you all see that? Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so a promising way to directly cut between inductive and deductive sorts of approaches is called data assimilation. This is just one way of doing it. It's not the sort of be all end all, but what you're trying to do here is bridge between observations and models. What makes snowpack a nice system to apply data assimilation is because we have physically based models where our mathematical equations are pretty well constrained, and we have pretty good observations, like I was mentioning with the airborne LiDAR. So the idea is, if you can see my cursor, you can make these observations from a model, make these estimates from a model with its own sets of biases, and then go out and make observations probably over a much smaller domain. And then data assimilation, things like ensemble Kalman filters, particle filters are used then to adjust the model to match the observations. So the idea here is you're getting the best of both worlds from a modeling and an observation point of view. I think I'm going to stop there just to leave some time for questions or comments. I think the goal here is to really drive towards inductive deductive approaches for tackling these different challenges. So kind of maybe in line of that, maybe I wonder if folks have comments. I do have a link to that figure.
So Adrian, I think you're talking about essentially like nudging the model to meet or match what you're observing directly. And
Nudging would be the simplest probably. So the problem with nudging is you have these state variables. And so if you nudge sort of an output variable, what do you do to the state variables?
right.
So a lot of these ensemble approaches, you're running many sets of models and then you're selecting out the model. So it is, yeah, nudging is the simple way to think about it, that I think you have to think about it that way first, because these data assimilation approaches are mathematically complex.
And involving ensembles of models, as you mentioned. Yeah.
Ensembles of models. Yeah.
Cool. But I like that description too, is the best of both worlds in a way.
Yeah, and this comes from conversations that Kristen and I had this summer, where I was sort of tracking this way, and Kristen mentioned data assimilation, and Rachel and I have had some conversations with folks in Spain that are working on this, so it's still kind of taking shape, but there's possibility to pursue it.
Excellent.
I know we're almost out of time, but this is so cool to see what is coming together. And I wondered what the next steps, and also what where Rachel is gonna start working on, and how that kind of comes together in like 1 minute.
Oh, Rachel, I hesitate to make you answer in 1 minute. So this stuff with Rachel, we're kind of laying the groundwork for the data assimilation. I think it takes a model, it takes observations, it takes, data assimilation. So that's coming together. Rachel's also putting together a plan for field work that would be in the Illilouette that would probably involve tracing some water tracers, and that work would also probably have there's similar tracing experiments going on in Seychen watershed. So the idea is maybe we could also do some kind of cross-site work with that. What else did I miss, Rachel?
And then there's also plans to do some more process-based modeling that hopefully can kind of complement what Andrew's doing, but looking more at spatial patterns.
And I had another slide showing some of the questions that Gabrielle's answering with her process-based rhesus modeling, but we ran out of time. But we just had a meeting, her and I, with Naomi Tag today, and Naomi, I think, gave us the nod on the questions and stuff. So this is really thinking about fire spread and the feedbacks of critical zone structure on fire spread with a model. And I guess the other update is we are, and I need to jump off right now to do an interview, but we are interviewing postdocs that would be hired onto this afternoon. So fingers crossed that we'll get a good candidate and make an offer that gets accepted.
And if anyone has insights into neat data analysis tools that they've used for looking at interannual variability and dealing with that, I mean, there are a lot of methods that we know and are using already, but if you've come across some new method or have some nice code that you would like to share for similar types of issues where you have a time series that is varying seasonally and has interannual variations due to just climate fluctuations, and still trying to piece out what changes might be independent of that. That's sort of our primary data challenge. And I know time meeting's over, so if anyone needs to drop off, please do. If anyone wants to stay and discuss anything, I can stay a little bit longer.
Thank you, everyone. I have to go for another meeting. Bye.
All right, well, thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Ms. Gabrielle?
Yeah.
Oh, wait, I guess I'll stop recording first before I go.